As I write this, the hype surrounding Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain has finally begun to settle. News of a troubled development, deleted and cut content have revealed a product that was not the masterpiece of work intended. But seeing this happen recently reminded me of another game that has lived on with such a contradicting legacy. A game praised by its critics and criticized by its makers. A title met with unmatched sales and backlash. An unrivaled success story that is also a cautionary tale of overambition. It reminded me of Halo 2.
We had doubt about whether the game was going to be successful, but we also didn't know if the Xbox was going to be successful, frankly. But we really didn't spend too much time thinking about, well, what would we do next, because the odds were stacked against us. Of course, when it hit and hit big, well, that's when we had to scramble.
And scramble they did. Halo 2 was officially announced 8 months after Combat Evolved was released. Bungie developed many sequels in the 90s, but this project was their first time in the spotlight. Halo Combat Evolved may not have been intended as Microsoft's killer app, but after millions of copies sold, near-perfect reviews, and even best-selling prequel novels, a sequel was guaranteed. Halo's development was plagued with financial struggles, tight deadlines, and the challenges of it not being conceived as a first-person shooter until a final year before launch. And yet, Combat Evolved laid the groundwork for a perfected sequel, and Bungie knew that this time the world would be watching. The pressure for a quality product was no longer just internal company standards. Very quickly, what began as a safe, logical evolution of the series morphed into one of the Xbox's most ambitious titles, with levels reported to be 10 times larger than their Halo 1 counterparts. But if Halo's development was chaos, Halo 2's development was the apocalypse. Endless experimentation and tinkering resulted in Bungie's Halo 2 demo showcased at E3 2003. The announcement trailer, released a year before, demonstrated Bungie's graphical talents, but their E3 demo was built to put everything else to shame. Live gameplay was shown to large groups of fans, eager to see what the follow-up to their favorite game had in store. The reaction, just as with Halo's launch, exceeded expectations.
I mean, when I'm watching the demo and you climb up on the cruiser and kick the guy off, I lost it.
It seemed like a war, like a real battle.
How the hell are we going to beat this game?
Hurry it up, let's get it out of here.
No, we can't wait another year. I'm sorry, we can't wait. This game has to come out now.
But there was a problem. At the time, most E3 showcases were pre-rendered for the purposes of maintaining a locked frame rate with highly detailed graphics. Bungie decided to show actual gameplay. Just as Sergeant Johnson says,
"This is a real-time feed. No smoke and mirrors, pre-recorded bullshit."
Sadly, smoke and mirrors is exactly what it turned out to be. Bungie spent an overly large portion of development on building a brand new graphics engine, one that would simultaneously look and run better than Halo's, with levels that were greatly expanded. Games often go through many changes, but there's no question that the graphics and overall feel of this E3 demo only resemble the final product in assets, not gameplay. Bungie has always kept its Halo engine a closely guarded secret, with little to no information about it online, but I've theorized that this early graphics engine was just a retooled version of the original game. I am not a developer, and similarities between the demo's footage could be due to using placeholders from Halo 1. The graphics engines take a long time to develop, and I doubt that Bungie were able to create a brand new one from scratch in less than 8 months. Whatever the case may be, this graphics engine would never see the light of day, and Bungie spent far too much time coaching along their deathbed. With their deadline extended by Microsoft, and with only a 5-minute demo of a broken game, Bungie made the hard choice and scrapped everything. The end result is what we purchased on November 9th, 2004. Unknown to the public, Bungie appeared to be pulling out all the stops for their sequel. The hype for Halo 2 was unparalleled, with enough gamers lining up outside of stores for network television to hop on board the Halo hype train. While it may be fun to look back on, the game's customers weren't interested in what Jimmy Kimmel had to say. They just wanted to jump in and stop the Covenant from invading Earth, like they were promised all those years ago. I'm going to cover this game's campaign in 3 acts, as I feel that it's hard to discuss Halo 2's merits without also covering development pressures and reactions from fans. Something I like about Halo 2 is that it immediately brings us back to the first game's ending with one image. Everything you remember about Combat Evolved is evoked in a single frame. While I have much to critique about the narrative, Halo had above-average cinematics for a video game, and already, Halo 2 is improving in this department. These camera angles are more fit for a television series than a standard video game, whereas most were content with boring shot-reverse shots to save time. We quickly discovered that this elite, one that looks like a general from the previous game, is being put on trial for failing to prevent your destruction of Halo. This begins Halo 2's storytelling goal of giving much more detail and understanding of the Covenant. In the original game, they were just an assortment of squishy hunchbacks standing in your way. Within the first 3 minutes of this opening cutscene, we've learned more about this alien faction than the entirety of the last game. I do enjoy this opening, both as something to give larger context to Halo 1 and a way to give us an understanding of the enemy. But here's the thing, because the last game was light on plot and had virtually no characterization of the enemy, many players watch this scene wondering who the hell this guy is and why we should care if he got screwed over by the Chief. I get the impression that Bungie were aware that a large portion of their audience wouldn't care about the Arbiter and just proceeded regardless. I'll give them credit for having the balls to do this, but at the same time, I can't really argue that these people are wrong. The game doesn't give an immediate reason to care about this guy. We've killed dozens of him in the last game. Why should we suddenly sit down and pay attention to his life? I care much more about story in games now compared to when I was 12 years old, which is when I first played Halo 2's campaign. In fact, I didn't even know until playing through recently that these elites are the High Council. My younger self became a lot more excited when seeing the Master Chief again, with a new suit of armor that looks a lot more badass. Thankfully, the Chief's new suit doesn't just affect cosmetics. While Halo 2 keeps all the core design pillars of its predecessor, its shield system was retooled. The health bar was removed, and in turn health packs, in exchange for shields that could take less damage but recharge much faster. This leads into Halo 2's greatest departure from Halo 1, the speed. Instead of floaty jump controls and a heavy weight of your character's suit, Halo 2 makes your character feel light and nimble, encouraging you to be a lot more aggressive. Master Chief's recharging shields would later be replicated with Call of Duty 2's regenerating health, and subsequently, the entire first-person shooter genre. But I can't blame Halo 2's shield system for other developers' inability to be creative. Just as with Halo 1's assortment of shield and weapon mechanics, Halo 2's works well, for the most part. Master Chief's vulnerability is more apparent in this game, something that I would consider a positive, except on Legendary, where the game's difficulty goes from relatively challenging to full retard.
What the fuck? What the fuck? But he survives it! This guy, this dinky little fucker survives it.
There's no doubt that this is the most difficult of any game in the series, and for all the wrong reasons. Heroic certainly becomes the most enjoyable way to play the game, as it's for the most part the right balance of difficulty, even though I think a setting between Legendary and Heroic would be nice. Unfortunately, cheap and sudden deaths can occur on Heroic, which is something that the original game had less of an issue with. It doesn't happen often, but there are occasions when your deaths feel more appropriate in Counter-Strike rather than a science fiction space marine simulator. Regardless of the game's changes, Halo 2's opening evokes much of the atmosphere from Halo's spaceship corridors. The Covenant attack on Earth begins with a bang, and allows the player to get used to the game's controls, combat model, and AI in a tight enclosed space before expanding the levels. But that actually becomes a problem, more on that later. Your goal in the opening is simple. The Covenant have a bomb, and it's your job to find it. Once your goal is achieved, the game's reveal trailer plays in full detail, but with a device not originally seen. Originally, you repelled the Covenant attackers, opened the airlock, flew to the Covenant ship, and played the next stage taking place inside of it. But as with many things in this game, the level was cut and replaced with an in-engine cutscene set piece that eventually leads into the game's next level that most closely resembles the E3 demo, where you fight the Covenant on Earth. I'm of the opinion that this cutscene is ridiculous, but in truth, that's not what bothers me. Blowing shit up is what the Master Chief does. My problem with this scene is that it's a set piece. Halo 1 used scripted sequences sparingly, whereas Halo 2 immediately has the Master Chief blowing up enemy ships single-handedly, and without involving the player. Outskirts takes place on Earth, and this is where fans of the game were excited. Every piece of marketing for Halo 2 heavily advertised this section. Unfortunately, it doesn't get off to a good start, with a small 2-story shelter to defend from Covenant forces. It's a real disappointment to tease players with the prospect of fighting aliens on Earth, only to have them camp in a building where they fend off 9 waves of enemies. Halo 1 featured a square room that was copy-pasted to the point of insanity. Knowing that this was done due to a lack of time, Bungie wanted every stage in this game to feel unique, and as a result, copy-paste rooms aren't nearly as common. But that doesn't mean the problem is fixed. It just presents itself in a different light. Instead of going through the same room 9 times throughout a stage, you fight off 9 waves of enemies in one room. The end result is the same, boring gameplay that's obviously padded. Thankfully, the level does open up, but this doesn't last long, because the vehicle section leads into a tunnel that you'll be locked into until the end of the stage.
Okay, everyone be cool.
Yeah, right.
Well,
Fuck this.
This appears to be nothing like the E3 demo that was shown in 2003, and it's disappointing that with only 2 levels taking place on Earth, the first one doesn't make a great impression. The next level, Metropolis, begins with a decent tank sequence and a brief encounter in the tunnels before leading you into a wide open space. However, this only leads into our second scripted set piece, the Scarab. Now, the reveal of this giant Covenant tank was great, as it was not seen in the E3 demo, but the sequence where you need to take it down is not great.
It was very scripted.
The way it was actually implemented in the game was boring as hell.
The design was horrible. It looked like a basket, like a handle. I'm going shopping. It's horrible.
The Scarab suffers from the same problem that every bad gaming set piece suffers from. For all its cool design, sounds, and movements, you ultimately walk up some stairs, kill 2 sets of enemies, cutscene, done. This wouldn't be a problem in a lesser game, but as said, Halo scripted sequences were minimal, and usually didn't do anything that you wouldn't see occur naturally through gameplay later on. The Scarab doesn't add to Halo's sandbox, it restricts it. But the set pieces aren't done. Because we've blown up a ship and a giant tank, why not blow up a whole city? Playing this again, my first question was, how many people just died? According to the game's wiki, nearly everyone in New Mombasa was evacuated, which would explain why this giant explosion of a city isn't trying to convey a little more shock. What's frustrating about these opening levels is that from a core design standpoint, the game is generally an improvement over its predecessor, with the movement, aiming, and shooting tightened up to perfection. Just as when Halo released in 2001, Halo 2 has a distinct feel in its controls and combat model that makes it hold up well by today's standards, whereas many other shooters from the same generation haven't aged well. Everything that's new to the game feels like a natural extension. Dual wielding and vehicle boarding don't radically change the game, but they enhance it with features that are useful, strategic, and enjoyable. But from a perspective of pacing, the game's first act is certainly weaker than that of Halo's. And this doesn't have anything to do with the first game having more mystery, and instead has everything to do with consistent gameplay. Within 3 levels, the first game demonstrated a variety of locations, level design, weapons, and enemy encounters. Halo 2's opening levels have 3 scripted sequences, only one of which is interactive, linear levels, and repetitive encounters. This first act isn't bad, but I would agree that it's a downgrade compared to Halo's first 3 missions. But once the Master Chief has waved goodbye to Earth, fans would be encountering a slight change to their player character. I imagine that many players in 2004 skipped this cutscene about Randy the alien, only to find themselves holding an energy sword with 3 fingers. Compared to Metal Gear Solid 2, the secrecy surrounding this character wasn't that extreme. There weren't any fourth wall breaking AIs to reveal your hidden backstory. But for a first-person shooter, many fans were shocked to find themselves playing a Halo game, but not as the Master Chief. And, as expected, not everyone was pleased with this decision. Microsoft were betting big on Halo 2, not only as a follow-up to their system seller, but also as a game that would cement Xbox Live. The marketing campaign was massive, with advertisements on billboards, websites, and television. All the publicity of the game's launch from major media outlets also helped. There's just one problem. Marketing gave the impression that Halo 2 would be a game where Master Chief defends Earth from the Covenant and saves humanity. So to find out that not only this isn't the case, and the Covenant arrived there by accident, but you're also playing as someone who isn't the Chief. I can understand why some people were upset. While the Arbiter's levels are often dismissed by fans, there is one thing I enjoy about his debut. It's the first time a Halo game made me think about the enemies I'm shooting at. To be fair, my 12-year-old self didn't really care, but when you know how Halo works and finding out that this heretic is actually speaking the truth, it adds some interesting context to how manipulative the Covenant are. Sadly, this level mostly consists of tight corridors similar to Assault on Control Room. Once again, these aren't bad, they're just not interesting. A Banshee section with Incubus playing in the background is pretty fun, but it's met with yet another set piece, where our character cuts the station's cable, forcing it into a freefall. Thankfully, this isn't as obnoxious as the Scarab or cutscenes, and leads us into something new to Halo 2, boss fights. Halo attempted to highlight its campaign with memorable scenarios, such as the Flood reveal and daring escape in the climax. Meanwhile, Halo 2 decided to pit you against a boss that you've learned about over the course of the game. This is a good way to connect story to gameplay, except that's not what happens in this fight with the Heretic leader. It's revealed that he has 343 Guilty Spark from the previous game, and yet, just when 343 is about to explain what Halo is to the Arbiter, the Heretic leader shoots at him and loses a potential ally. All so we can have a rather anticlimactic boss fight with mechanics we've seen in other games. This level isn't assisted by the appearance of the Flood, enemies that damaged Halo's second half. But it's not just that the Flood aren't interesting to fight against with their stupid AI and minimal tactics, it's the level design. Arbiter's second level of the game navigates you through bland corridors until you're stuck in an elevator, fighting off an endless but easy stream of Flood while this elevator moves at the speed of litigation. Needless to say, these debuting levels for the Arbiter aren't likely to give the best impressions of a new player character, and unknown at the time, things were only going to get worse. Till then, the story jumps back to the Master Chief's adventure, with their explosive space jump landing them in front of another Halo ring world. Humanity wastes no time dropping off the Master Chief within 30 seconds of discovering the planet, and the Covenant have already set up shop, despite your ship being right behind them. Plot inconsistencies aside, these next two levels are great. In fact, they may be the best that the campaign has to offer. The green jungles and ancient structures are beautiful scenery. Enemy encounters vary from tight close quarters battles, open-ended sniping, and/or vehicle sections. Unfortunately, it's clear that these spaces aren't as large as Bungie originally intended.
It's exploring huge environments, 10 times the size of Halo 1.
Even with this being one of the larger levels in the game, I'd say that it's still smaller than Halo's second level. Also unfortunate are repeated rooms just before facing off the Prophet of Regret. Thankfully, these encounters are still enjoyable, and they're not cloned to the point of insanity. Regret serves as the game's second boss fight, and it's the best in my opinion. Multiple floors give you different vantage points, elites with energy swords force you to be aware of your surroundings, and punching Regret is utterly hilarious. Chief's final punch signals the end of his brief return, as this level concludes with him being passed out in water for no reason, before being arbitrarily plucked away by Japanese tentacle porn. Once again, these rushed events in the story are taking place in order to make up for cut content. According to the developer commentary, one more stage with the Chief was planned, where he boarded a Forerunner tank that goes super fast until tentacles crash all around him, revealing the Gravemind. Back in the land of the Arbiter, elites are being disavowed by the Covenant and replaced with brutes. Following this news, the Arbiter is sent to find the sacred icon, which we know to be the index from the first game, located at the library. Okay, to be fair, this level isn't as wretched as the original library, but that doesn't mean it's good. You still spend a large majority of this stage progressing down gray corridors to fight off the worst enemies in the game. I do appreciate how the infected revive fallen combat forms instead of just having them come back to life at random like in the first game, and your lowered shield capacity does make fights a little bit more tense. But it just doesn't change the fact that when you face an enemy whose only tactic is to charge, there is no reason to use anything other than the shotgun and the sword. You do fight a variety of sentinels, but they're not designed as equals for the player, and instead feel like buggers on Ambien with their slow movements and weak weapons. This too goes for the larger forms of sentinels that you battle against, and hey, wait a minute. The level is completed with a faithful callback to the original library and a cutscene with Miranda and Sergeant Johnson. I don't understand why military squads in Halo constantly risk the death of their captain, but I guess it's just to connect Miranda to her father. This, of course, is when the brute chieftain Tartarus gets his hands on the index and reveals that the prophet of Hitler, I mean Truth, set you up and is leaving you for dead. Big shock. Concluding the game's second act is its grand reveal of the Flood's greatest form, known as a Gravemind. At this point, the parallels between the Arbiter and Chief were supposed to be uncanny, but due to the cut content, this scene doesn't have the build-up and personal connection it should have had. After all, it's been nearly an hour since we last played with the Chief, and the player just finished by far the worst 2 levels in the game as the Arbiter. My biggest problem with this scene is that the player is not in sync with the characters. The player knows how Halo works, and to have 5 individuals discuss something that we already understand is tedious. Meanwhile, the only thing that we don't have prior knowledge of, the Gravemind, doesn't get explained at all. We don't know anything about its origin, expansion, abilities. Hell, some fans weren't even entirely sure if it was actually part of the Flood prior to Halo 3's release. Just as with Halo, the game's presentation of this story is a lot more effective than the story itself. I especially love the Gravemind's menacing and inhumane voice, along with the variety of a monitor, a prophet, and of course, Keith David and Steve Downes contesting to see who has the deeper voice. Before a victor is decided, the Gravemind tasks both of them with finding the index and preventing the rings from being activated, teleporting them to different locations. Because as the developers say,
you know, when it's hard to get from one place in the Halo universe to another, you know what you do? You teleport.
The game's final batch of missions conflict me. On the one hand, they copy-paste rooms more than any of the previous levels. On the other, they have an excellent variety of enemies, scenery, and music. High Charity really hits the mark, not just with its level design, but in showing the civil war erupting between elites and the Covenant. In some ways, I thought it would have been more interesting to have the Arbiter return to High Charity and see it being turned into a battlefield, but thankfully, the Arbiter's short end of the stick finally evaporates, and he is given a good set of missions. In fact, he has one of the best moments where you get to fight alongside hunters at the very end. It's unfortunate that the plot leads to you fighting an enemy that Bungie didn't have enough time to make just as interesting of an opponent as the elites, but there's still plenty of fun to be had. These missions still don't feel any larger than their Halo 1 counterparts, but the battlefields open up, and the vehicle sections do an excellent job of breaking up the pace. Part of me would like to argue that the game's third act is the strongest, but there's just one fatal flaw. The end of the game is infamous for an obvious reason, but many issues do occur before then. First of all, Tartarus could have prevented an entire third and fourth game from happening if he just forced Miranda to use the index like he eventually does regardless. Second, 343 Guilty Spark could have explained what he's programmed to explain hours earlier. Third, this boss fight is balls. Whether or not having these in Halo 2 was a wise decision is irrelevant, as it doesn't excuse the lame solution to defeating Tartarus. In fact, you don't really fight him. All the player does is hang out until Johnson drains the brute's shield, and from there, pump him full of lead. As for the moment that you remember, what is there to say about it? No, really, this sudden cut to black followed by credits doesn't exactly have a lot to dissect. Bungie knew this ending was terrible and that they were going to just have to suffer the consequences and live with it. Luckily for Bungie, their multiplayer team had much greater success. Xbox Live may have been released in 2002, but it wasn't a staple of Microsoft's platform until Bungie utterly annihilated every other multiplayer shooter on the market. The greatest compliment of Halo 2's multiplayer was that it transcended its console reputation and surpassed top-of-the-line PC shooters in terms of accessibility and usability. Friends lists, pre-game lobbies, clans, parties, text and voice messages, proximity voice, matchmaking, playlists, emblem creation, skill-based ranking, and even with all of that, Bungie planned to do more. Players who managed to obtain the game's closed beta build found that its main menu has something familiar to fans of the game's third installment. Sadly, saved films, much like Halo 2's single-player content, had to be cut. There is no questioning Halo 2's impact on the industry in terms of its multiplayer component. Looking back on it, most multiplayer games still have a less intuitive interface and friend system than Halo 2, a game released before the existence of HD consoles. As for the gameplay, it was Halo and it was online, automatically making it one of the top played games of its day. In fact, it held the title as the most played game on Xbox Live until Gears of War was released a full 2 years later. In 2014, I wrote an article where I granted Halo 2 with the title of the greatest multiplayer game ever made. However, in this series, I'm supposed to be the nitpicking critic, so without further ado, I will attempt to remove my Halo beer goggles and judge this game's multiplayer component as fairly and objectively as I can. How objective I can be about a game I've played nearly 7,000 rounds of, I'll leave you to judge. Just as with Combat Evolved, Halo 2 uses all the weapons, abilities, vehicles, and mechanics as a campaign, excluding the flashlight and cloak. But also like Combat Evolved, these weapons, abilities, and vehicles behave very differently in multiplayer from their intended function, the most obvious example being the battle rifle. The majority of maps in the game used SMGs as the default starting weapon. This decision was most likely made to allow more opportunities for dual wielding, but also to make the game more accessible to newcomers. The SMG is more or less a reskin of the assault rifle from Halo 1, and the battle rifle is Halo 2's equivalent of the pistol. As I covered in my previous video, Halo 1's multiplayer is fun, but unforgiving. A brand new player in Halo 1 would get absolutely blitzed by even a mediocre player who just knew that the pistol was what they should be using in most situations. Therefore, the decision was made to have the battle rifle a pickup by default. Since the competitive community was used to Halo 1's fast kill times and high damage pistol, it was quickly adopted as the primary weapon in their match settings. Team Hardcore and Major League Gaming matches illustrate how the BR changed over time. Originally, its kill time of 4 3-shot bursts for skilled players restricted the weapon for mid-range firefights, but then came along a little glitch that changed all of that.
The multi-season final boss, this is how I BXR. BXR is a little glitch in this game, where you get in close range combat and kill them a little bit faster. It's called BXR because B is what you do to melee, X cancels out the small timing in between, and R shoots.
Suddenly, this mid-range rifle has become a close-quarters devastator. Once again, a Halo game features a weapon that's a jack-of-all-trades, master of none. With it not being as good as a sniper rifle at long range, and not as good as a shotgun or sword during up-close encounters. With one large difference, this wasn't originally intended. Neither was the double shot, a glitch with the same weapon that would allow you to increase the battle rifle's rate of fire for 2 bursts. Fly in the ointment is that 1, it's hard, much harder than the BXR, and 2, if you cancel the glitch, it leaves you vulnerable to the enemy. The reason that competitive players and even subpar players such as myself defend these 2 glitches is that, intentional or not, they're consistent with Halo's sandbox. The BXR and double shot come with consequences if used incorrectly, and that's always been how Halo balances its combat model, with every weapon, ability, and vehicle having pros and cons. Admittedly, it does make the game less forgiving to newcomers. Players who refuse to use these glitches in more competitive modes are going to be eaten alive in certain scenarios. Ultimately, I do find these glitches to be a positive, and communities within the game will always be divided by skill levels. I won't have very much fun getting wombo comboed in Smash, and a new player in Halo 2 won't have very much fun losing to a double shot. It's just how these things work. What a multiplayer game should do is provide enough content to satisfy all skill levels, and that's something Halo 2 did accomplish. The game's more fluid movement system, forgiving auto-aim, and faster pace allowed people to get into the action much more quickly, both in small-scale arenas and large open big team maps. Bungie's multiplayer team greatly expanded game types and the variety of map designs. Nearly every Halo 1 map uses symmetric design. That's to say, a map would be identical for both teams. Halo 2 shook this up, with many more asymmetric maps, both in small and large scale. Lockout, Ivory Tower, and Ascension for 4v4 arena matches, Burial Mound, Zanzibar, and Headlong for big team. These were expanded upon with the game's downloadable content, with levels such as Turf, Gemini, and Terminal. Overall, Halo 2's map selection is fantastic, and I think it's by far the best in the series. It's got something for every scale and style of play. Not only that, but they can all be replayed countless times. There's an infinite number of strategies, and which ones are viable can be altered depending on the game type. Lockout Team Slayer plays much differently compared to Team Ball on the same map. In Team Slayer, it's usually a contest between the BR and Sniper towers. In Team Ball, the map's enclosed spaces become a lot more vital to success. Bungie understood that if they wanted to keep people coming back for years after the game's release, their maps needed to be enjoyable after hundreds, if not thousands of times. But as with everything, I do have complaints. First of all, Foundation is by far the game's worst map. It was based on a series of levels from Bungie's previous shooter franchise, Marathon, but it doesn't work well with Halo's design, and it isn't very enjoyable in any of the official game types. Matches that begin with SMGs on this map consist of nothing but players charging with dual-wielding bullet hoses. This is due to the starting weapon not having enough range. The flip side with BR starters on this map is that it consists of nothing but tedious mid-range firefights across each base. Neither game type was very enjoyable. Once again, this result would be altered due to an accident formed by the community, but I'll get to that soon. What's more, having an endless combination of maps, modes, and weapons means that some combinations aren't very much fun. Free-for-all swords, 4v4 Slayer on large maps, and plasma rifle defaults were all officially seen in the game at some point, all of which work equally terrible. What's more, the changes made to Halo 2's timers and spawns can lead to some frustration. Now, the respawn timer for a weapon will not begin until it's drained of all ammunition and discarded by the player using it. This leads to many occasions where one team will have all the power weapons and the other has nothing to contest them with, other than coordinating shots, something that on maps like Ascension are too large for battle rifles to defeat snipers. This is even worse in SMG starting matches, especially in team doubles. During 2v2 matches that begin with a stapler, the battle rifle is effectively a power weapon. If one team grabs both BRs on midship, they can easily sit at the top of Pink Tower and proceed to mow down all enemies who can't even damage them with their starting weapons. Finally, some glitches are abused. I've defended the BXR and double shot. What I cannot defend is exiting the game's boundaries and camping outside of the map with the infamous noob combo. This doesn't add anything to Halo's sandbox and is just a cheap exploit for players who don't want to earn their level 50 by skill. Halo 2's spawn system is generally an improvement over Halo 1's, this time accounting for the location of teammates and firefights taking place on the battlefield. But it's not perfect, and can still be exploited. For example, as long as you've got your team positioned at the sniper and BR towers on lockout, the enemy will endlessly respawn at bottom blue. Halo 2's multiplayer has many faults. Most of the dual-wield combinations are worthless. Melees can miss their target due to a simple bump in the geometry, some gimmicks don't add much to gameplay, and standbying, along with godlike host, were very real problems. Is Halo 2 the greatest multiplayer game of all time? From a technical standpoint, probably not. If someone thinks it's not, I can understand where they're coming from, but it's still one of my top 3 multiplayer arenas. I remember feeling genuinely sad when Microsoft shut down Xbox Live servers in 2010. Everything from glitching out on Gemini to lockout 1v1s and endless midship FFAs, it's filled with enough memories to last for years. That part is certainly my nostalgia, but the game's pace, feel, speed, and sheer fun factor is not. Compared to other shooters of its day, Halo 2 feels so refined and competitively viable. If the game's original servers had never been shut down, I'd still be returning to it, and I wouldn't be alone. Judging a game's value is subjective on many levels, but I believe a way to identify a true masterpiece of multiplayer gaming is when it spawns games within its game. This is something that Halo 2, despite its lack of map makers, sharing files, or even full control over configurations, achieved. If you had a group of regular friends or a clan, custom games extended Halo 2's lasting value for years. Game types such as Troy, a 16 big team battle utilizing Halo 2's remake of Blood Gulch to recreate the feeling of bows, arrows, and swords in a sci-fi shooter. Zombies, where a group of survivors would defend themselves against an ever-increasing wave of the undead. And by that, I mean the Green Team. I remember countless shouting matches against players who wouldn't manually switch when they were supposed to. But it did turn Foundation from Halo 2's most boring map to an epic standoff where players would shove crates to an entrance to slow down The Walking Dead. Tower of Power, a mode similar in gameplay but altered in concept, is where two teams fight for control over a turret located on the main tower of Ascension. I've heard that some people also played this on Lockout, but from my experience, Ascension was the more favored level for this mode. Everyone is given only a shotgun, so you must force teammates to push you in numbers. I know people that would play this for hours and never get tired of the constant battle. I know that I've only scratched the surface, missing out on other community modes such as Hog Wars, Boxing, and ones that I've never even got to play such as President CTF. Halo 2's extensive downloadable content that nearly doubled the game's map selection, addition and tweaking of playlists, coupled with a community experimenting with every asset of gameplay, shows just how much Bungie nailed their first attempt at creating an online experience for a major franchise. The enjoyment of glitching out of maps with friends or turning the battle rifle into a close-range meat grinder may not have been intentional, but it still enhanced an already brilliant multiplayer game that I can still play endlessly to this day. Except that's not entirely accurate. As you can probably tell, the version I've been recording for this video is the Master Chief Collection, which in reality is a slightly altered build of the game's Windows Vista port. Halo 2's PC version has a few unintentional quirks, and unlike the game's glitches, these did not enhance the experience. Poor hit detection decreased the reliability of every rifle, the range of said rifles were diminished, the carbine's fire rate increased substantially, melee attacks, especially with the oddball, often would stop just before hitting their target. In fact, this modified version of Halo 2 Vista featured hit detection that was so poor 343 Industries had to release a patch months later addressing the problem. But it's far from solved. Halo 2 Vista and Halo 2 Classic in the Master Chief Collection are not exactly the same as the original, and it's very unlikely that you'll be able to experience the game's original multiplayer component. I've used services like Xlink Kai and Xbox Connect, but it's very rare to find a server with sufficient ping, as most are hosted by players in South America. Realistically, the only way you're going to play the original multiplayer game is if you system link, which I doubt many people have the ability to do. Ultimately, I feel that people like me play Halo 2 Classic because it's as close to the original as you're going to get, even if it's not as good as the original. Let's finally return to the single-player campaign and compare these three versions. Just as with Combat Evolved, Halo 2 holds up pretty well from a gameplay standpoint. Unfortunately, I can't accurately comment on its frame rate. My version of the game slows down constantly, but the disc is also scratched to hell, and my Xbox 360 arcade is very old and beat up. I don't recall the original game slowing down this much, and it doesn't seem to be happening during other Let's Plays I've seen on YouTube. While Halo 2 may not have improved in ways that Bungie intended, it does feature enhancements from the original game. It certainly looks better, feels much more responsive to control, and has better weapon design overall. Some weapons may be pretty useless in the multiplayer component, but in the campaign they all serve a purpose, even if some have been downgraded. Also improved is the audio. Voice acting is much better this time around with memorable dialogue and a great cast. Sound effects are both impactful and informative to the player, and Marty O'Donnell's score is arguably the best in the entire series. It's certainly my favorite. Halo's soundtrack was great, but Halo 2's gives me goosebumps to this day. Halo 2 Vista does have problems that drastically affect its gameplay in multiplayer, but as for a single-player experience, it's perfectly fine. The game looks a lot better with higher resolutions and textures, and it's easy to use any gamepad with. But it does lack a feature I quite enjoyed from the original, and that's the elimination of loading screens. The original version of Halo 2 would load once, and from there on, each campaign level and cutscene is connected with the loading process being hidden. It makes for a much more seamless experience. To be fair, the loading times on PC are so fast it's ultimately a minor gripe, but I don't understand why this feature wasn't utilized. Which brings me to Halo 2 Anniversary. What started as a minor problem in Halo 2 Vista became the elephant in this game's room. Because of the new cutscenes and the retouched levels and sounds, the game has a lot more data to process, and therefore results in you staring at these. In my last video, I said that I preferred the original Halo's visuals and sounds compared to the Anniversary version of Combat Evolved, which in my opinion didn't keep its visuals consistent with the music, audio, and style. With this in mind, I should prefer the original version of Halo 2, because Anniversary makes changes that are even more drastic than its predecessor. Levels are composed of textures, lighting, and an atmosphere that is so far removed from the original, it's sometimes hard to notice it's the same game. But that is actually what works in its favor. This time, Saber Interactive and 343 didn't just update the graphics, but the cutscenes, music, and audio. It doesn't suffer from Halo's Anniversary lack of consistency. The whole experience has been retooled to fit its new style, which I approve of. It also helps that there are some genuine improvements here. While I don't like the way that these new elites look, I'd be lying if I said that Blur Studios didn't do an outstanding job with these cutscenes. 343 Industries has some of the most talented audio designers in the industry, and their hand in Halo 2 Anniversary is much appreciated. Every weapon sounds appropriately devastating, along with the Foley effects. The remastered score isn't as notable as the original, but that's a losing battle. Some covers just can't beat the originals, but the new music is still great, and enhances Anniversary, as it does the job of maintaining its consistency of audio and visuals. Sadly, this means that there's now no Breaking Benjamin song in this level, which basically means there's now no reason for it to exist. Halo 2 is a sad game, not because of its story or characters, but because it's a third of the game Bungie wanted to create. Researching the game's development was utterly depressing, listening and reading the developers talk about having to throw away content they worked on for years, committing a full year of crunch time to finish a game that they knew was inferior to their original vision. It's every artist's nightmare. And you know what the worst part is? It was completely avoidable. Bungie could have used a more reliable game engine from the start. They could have kept the founders of their company more attached to the project earlier on. They could have used their year-long delay to polish the game instead of rebuilding it from scratch. Bungie paid hard for their mistakes, but they are their mistakes. Even though Halo 2 is not the game it could have been, I have an immense respect for all the members of the team. They sacrificed so much of their time and lives all to create a game that people would ultimately enjoy. It's a commitment that only a few studios can say about themselves. And in the end, it all worked out. Halo 2's campaign may not be a masterpiece, but it's still a solid ride, and its multiplayer component changed online gaming forever. And even with their feet to the fire, Bungie were still years ahead of their time. All I hope for each member of the team involved in this game's development is that they never have to go through an experience like making it, ever again.